Okay, hello class. My name is Trevor Hyatt. This is my presentation on psychedelics and death, ego transcendence, and finding peace with death. Opening the doors of perception. Many different psychedelics have been used to help patients ease non physical suffering. Some of these include ketamine, psilocybin, LSD, and some forms of ayahuasca as well. Psychedelics may induce ego death or ego dissolution, which can allow feelings of oneness with everything. This is also, some people call this a type of mystical experience, and that was one of the studies that Timothy Leary did using psychedelics to occasion mystical type experiences. So, by transcending everyday consciousness, psychedelics can help ease and prepare people for their final trip in this life, which is dying. The reason I chose this topic is because, as we mentioned in our final module, on November 22nd, 1963, Aldous Huxley dies with his wife administering him LSD. She gave him about 100 micrograms into his vein. That's like a pretty full trip. And they said it was a very peaceful trip. I'm going to get into that in another slide. So let's break down, if you do not know, what are psychedelics? According to dictionary.com, of or noting a mental state characterized by a profound sense of intensified sensory perception, sometimes accompanied by severe distortion and hallucinations, and by extreme feelings of either euphoria or despair. LSD users seek the psychedelic properties of the drug, including heightened sensory experiences. Some of the common psychedelics, we've got DMT, LSD, and psilocybin. And this is just like the chemical name. With all these, there's varying different, you can tweak the molecule and get many different things. But the brief overview is DMT is a powerful visual psychedelic which produces short acting effects when smoked. It is used orally in combination with an MAOI, as in ayahuasca brews. It is naturally produced in the human body and by many plants. I got all this information for the drugs from a great resource called arrowwood.org. It's a great resource to learn about drugs and to be safe. LSD. LSD is the best known and most researched psychedelic. It is the standard against which all other psychedelics are compared. It is active at extremely low doses and is most commonly available on blotter or in liquid form. The blotter is like a piece of paper with squares that you can rip apart because it's one of the easiest ways to dose it. It's one of the most potent psychedelics. So that is a way that they've found to dose it appropriately. Psilocybin, also the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, as many people call them. There are more than 180 species of mushrooms that contain the psychedelic chemicals psilocybin or psilocin. They have a long history of use in Mexico and are currently one of the most popular and commonly available natural psychedelics. It's a big boom today. People are growing them at home. Go figure. Ego death. This is one of the things that psychedelics can bring on. So, if we're defining ego death, it is an experience in which you lose your sense of self by cultivating a deep sense of awareness. So, this is kind of a mystical experience. And there's a Sufi quote, something along the lines of, you must die before you die, or something like, you must be annihilated in love. It's just like you have to completely lose yourself in God or whatever that may be. Um, Preparing for death. So, experiencing ego death can relieve end of life suffering because you realize that you're more than your conscious self and identity that you've created. It brings awareness to a bigger picture beyond life. In the same way, transcendental experiences show you there's more than regular consciousness. So, this can be a really practical way that people can prepare for death because when you have this experience that takes you out of the ordinary, you realize that there's probably something else beyond this life, when you die. So, lessening the fear of death. Several recent clinical trials showing that a single treatment with the psychedelic psilocybin produced sustained decreases in anxiety and depression among patients with life threatening cancer diagnoses. So, I'm going to talk about that later as well. But these are practical and real applications that psychedelics have been proven, according to some studies, um, to be effective in. Transcendence. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, I don't know if I said that right, serves as a guide for the deceased consciousness through the intermediate state, the Bardo, between death and rebirth. Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert, now known as Ram Dass, before he passed away, wrote a book, The Psychedelic Experience, a manual written on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Dr. Owen Anderson also mentioned this in his last module. The book uses the process of death and rebirth presented in it as a metaphor for the experience of ego death or depersonalization that is commonly experienced under the influence of psychedelic drugs. The book is dedicated to Aldous Huxley, who wrote The Doors of Perception, who, as we mentioned, was in the last module. So, kind of this idea that, we are not our identity, we are something more than that. That's kind of what the ego death helps us, experience, or depersonalization. And these things can be very tumultuous and difficult for people to deal with as well, especially if they're not primed and do not integrate it, or if they have, pre existing conditions. So, Aldous Huxley, he wrote The Doors of Perception. Huxley wrote an autobiographical book about his experience with the psychedelic mescaline. He recalls the insights he experienced, ranging from purely aesthetic to sacramental vision, and reflects on their philosophical and psychological implications. So, he was one of the first people to write publicly about psychedelics and, was very influential, obviously, to Timothy Leary, who was a huge influential figure as well. And he wrote a book also called The Island. A lot of people know his book called Brave New World, which is about a dystopian society. The Island was influenced by his psychedelic use and talks about things like using psychedelics to help people with coming of age and just how it's like integrated into the society and how people pass on to the next life, which is something that he practiced in his own life. So it's really cool to see and know. Huxley's psychedelic death. On his deathbed, his wife, Laura Huxley, administered him with LSD. The 5 people present at his death said it was the most peaceful, most serene death they'd seen from someone with that condition. There was a couple of nurses and doctors there with him, and they were expecting him to be having like lung convulsions and all this type of stuff. But he passed on very peacefully to the next world. And if you're asking me, there's probably no better way to go than if you're tripping already. Kind of smooth that transition out. Stanislav Grof. He is a Czech-born American psychiatrist. Grof is one of the principal developers of transpersonal psychology and the research into the use of non-ordinary states of consciousness for purposes of psychological healing, deep self-exploration, and obtaining growth and insights into the human psyche. Stan Grof used LSD in the early 1960s to research explore its effects on terminally ill patients, including those with cancer, and found it could help them face their condition. In 1972, publications concluded that LSD had provided considerable pain relief for those patients, as shown in statistical results from 31 patients. I think this was called the Spring Grove experiments, and there's also a lot of criticism of that study. So, we have to be fair and we have to analyze. Some people also had bad experiences. But there's considerable benefit, and they also didn't use a control. So some scientists would scrap the whole study, but I love Stan Grof. He's done the most research with LSD than anyone else. He's got some great interviews online too as well. The Johns Hopkins University study, this is something that kind of became popular and was in the news a lot. A small double-blind study, Johns Hopkins, a notable university, researches researchers report that a substantial majority of people suffering cancer related anxiety or depression found considerable relief for up to 6 months from a single large dose of psilocybin, the active compound in hallucinogenic magic mushrooms. So, some of these mechanisms potentially but behind the reduced fear of death, mystical experiences offer a new perspective. Once you've had that transcendental experience, it can give you a new issue, it can give you a new perspective about any issues troubling you, especially death, which is something we all have to face and come to terms with. Experiencing oneness, when you experience oneness, it kind of gives you this idea that maybe when you die, there's hope to re-experience something like that. um, Releasing trauma, people who've confront and overcome mental traumas can just die with more peace. I mean, the Tibetan Book of the Dead claims those who live a peaceful life will have a peaceful death. Some ethical considerations, we got the legality, safety, and consent. I have to make sure I don't go over my time. It's another consideration. Legality, obviously, most psychedelics, if not all, I mean, there's a few that are illegal. The good ones are illegal, of course. So you got to consider that. Safety, this is something that I do not advise anyone to do. And, everyone should make their own decisions, but there is a very real risk. But there's a real risk in life. So, I say, why not? Consent, obviously, it's a difficult consideration, and somebody has to really be known of the risks and accept to it if they want to. My personal reflection is I've truly been interested in psychedelics for a long time now. I've seen a lot of people's growth get catalyzed in their lives. I mean, there's a lot of famous people like the Beatles, many artists, and everything who've helped, tap in to these realms and make themselves successful. I believe that our awareness expands taking psychedelics, and this awareness bolsters our lives and helps us be at peace with the reality we're living in. It helps you realize how weird it is, and also that like we're living in it. I had an experience with LSD where I was like sitting watching the cottonwood just like fly through the air, and I was like, I felt myself kind of expand, and it felt like I became everything for just a brief moment. But in my mind, that was like a reflection of like what's gonna happen when we die. Those are my references. Let's hope that was 15 minutes. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something. Oh wow, can I see how long that was? Oh, that's perfect.